Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. um, I'm in some ways sorry to interrupt this wonderful noise that indicates the pleasure that people are having in making contacts and meeting each other. But there will be lots of time for that after the panel. And I also know, because many of you have said, that you are keen to hear from this really interesting group of people that we've got together to talk about one of the most important subjects facing us all. However, before I turn to the panel, I thought you might want a few words of the latest news from Queen's. And we're in week 4 of Trinity term, if you remember back to those ways of counting, which means it's a mix of anxiety and exam-taking nerves amongst the undergraduates and euphoria and celebration, with the latter kind of rising as the term goes through. And what we're seeing, what we're hoping for from the undergraduates is that they keep us where we have been nicely sort of averaged over the last few years in the top 10 or so colleges in terms of results, which is a good place to be. So we put our trust in them. And alongside of the academic work, however, many other things are happening. So the rugby team won the Cuppers Shield last weekend, and the boats haven't had such a good time because of the rain has meant that the river has been pretty unnavigable quite often. But on Saturday, a chaplain and I are christening a new boat, and there'll then be summer 8s. It's strange the things you find yourselves doing, like christening boats. The Egglesfield Musical Society has its opening night tomorrow with Into the Woods. And again, we hope the rain holds off for that, but it'll be lovely, whatever, and even more fun under umbrellas. And the JCR elected next year's president in the kind of annual cycle of college politics. The MCR, I should say, has been really active the last couple of years. Following COVID, a group of students got together and instituted a whole new programme. So it's been really nice to see them in and around the college, much more than perhaps a few years back. So there's lots happening. And it's a testament to the bonds that are formed that it's also been a very good year for fundraising. So the kind of support that we've been getting for the tutorial system, for access and outreach, and for the building fabric, and for students' welfare more generally, has been fantastic. We have, amongst other things, and building on a number of other gifts, received a large Waverley gift, which many of you will see, which means that the music fellow and a new post of choir director are funded in perpetuity. So there's an endowment to cover those. And that's a real tribute to the quality of music and the kind of experience that those of many of you, I'm sure, have enjoyed. And it's lovely to see, particularly at a time when I think sometimes the humanities, probably wrongly, but actually feel themselves under threat. So that was really nice. But we're not resting, because what we really want to do is secure the tutorial system forever, and also to have the kind of support for every student and early career researcher that we possibly can. Which is why you will have seen, and if you have, sorry, is that okay? Or shall I use the other mic? Okay, it's the aircon. This is a wonderful kind of post-industrial. We're saying it might be a bit apocalyptic, kind of, to fit with the theme of climate change. This secret room. So you may have seen deceptive chocolates around. They're part of the first Giving Day that we're going to hold on the 29th and 30th of May. And this is something where the aim is to have over 200 people give over £200,000. And we already have £80,000 of matched funding for the first gifts. But it's a new way of involving people in that way of taking part in the college. But, and I really do want to say this, being part of Queen's is absolutely not only or even always about money. So some of the people here are also, for example, tutors in our new outreach partnership in schools in Lancashire and Cumbria, giving time. The Queen's Women's Network, of whom we have several here, have been running a really interesting sequence of events, most recently a speed networking event in the upper library, which was brilliant. It was a way of getting a lot of students to hear about a lot of different career paths, and it was really lively and really well attended. So all sorts of things like that. But most importantly, basically, simply by being here, meeting each other and staying in touch with the college, it's wonderful to have you enriching Queen's community in that way. So I want to turn to the topic of the evening before we get back to drinks. We have, as you know, a panel of 4 people who are going to talk about the sustainability transition from really different perspectives. So it's a bit of an experiment, but I think it's a fascinating mix, and they're all willing to do it. Rather like a college, this panel is a mix of disciplines and of generations and of sectors, and that's one of the places that really makes colleges unique. So I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak. The first is going to be Sara Habib, who was originally a mathematician and philosopher and is now the head of future price controls at National Grid. Then Matthew Bilson, who took an MSc in Energy Systems, is now Director of Policy and Market Strategy at Piclo, and was previously a civil servant working on energy policy for around 20 years. We have civil service in common. Then Xinyue Liu, who is a DPhil student in fine arts. And finally, Steve Kelly, a tutorial fellow in biology and a member of the college's governing board. So each is going to speak for around 5 minutes, and some have slides, some don't, and then we'll have discussions and very much look forward to your questions and see where this really interesting set of people on this really important topic takes us. So Sara, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to, in typical industry style, pull up my slides. So good evening, I'm Sara Habib. I have been nearly quarter a century in the energy industry and working at National Grid. I love my role. I went into it because I wanted to do something that felt really important to society. And when I started, nearly 25 years ago, it was about, getting the electrons from where they were made to where they were needed. It was about reliability. It was about a safe, reliable network. And actually, we didn't really want to be in the media, because if we were in the media at National Grid, it generally meant something had gone wrong. And we were proud not to be. So we are all about the high voltage network. I work specifically in our electricity transmission business, the motorways of power, the big electric forest, as we like to think of it, because we're very romantic about some of the infrastructure that not many other people enjoy looking at. But that's where I work, and that's what I love. We are now in the media. We are right at the heart of the energy transition. And if you're not busy, you're not in energy. And we are responding, as the slide says, we're responding to a world impacted by conflict in energy and climate change. So we often talk about the energy trilemma. We talk about affordability, the need to transition to net zero, and energy security. And for a long time, those things, for us in industry, felt in conflict. How do we transition to net zero? How do we connect renewable generation, which has a cost, but make sure that energy is still affordable? How do we maintain reliability and security of our energy when we've been so used to coal and gas generation and a network that operates on that? They felt a point of tension. But actually, sort of, as always, world politics, and the changing nature of that, the crisis in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, suddenly collapsed that trilemma. And the affordability of renewable generation collapsed that trilemma. The answer is actually the 3 things combined. What we have seen in our industry is that connecting and cleaner, greener, renewable generation is going to get us to more affordable generation, is also going to help with our energy security. So the race is on. The race is on to hit government targets. The race is on to get to a 2035 decarbonised energy system and to get to a 2050 net zero. And that gets us not only to a more sustainable future, but an affordable future for consumers, and also a future where we have energy security in this country. And that is massively exciting for us at National Grid Electricity Transmission because it is the largest overhaul of the electricity grid we have seen in generations. It is the largest overhaul of the grid since it was built in the 50s, 60s and 70s. It is like the reimagination of our whole energy network. So what you can see on the very far side is actually an ad that was taken out by the CEGB, the Central Electricity Generating Board, the kind of the grandfather or grandmother of the energy system that we know today. And it was an ad in Country Living. She can't have one without the other. You know, something, a sign of the times, precariously balanced on her washing machine. She can't have electrification and the modern appliances, or we can't have those modern appliances without the electricity network to bring that power to our homes. Below it is something that we're now putting out there in the public. It's called the Great Grid Upgrade. It's today's modern day advert. The message is just the same. If we want to connect a North Sea of wind, of offshore wind, a Saudi Arabia of wind, if we want to transition to renewables, to that affordable, secure generation, we're going to need the infrastructure to get it to people's homes. And we're going to have to reimagine our whole energy network. And we need to do it in a way that we bring consumers, communities with us. So we need a whole new grid, and it's not just that we need to build more infrastructure because electrification is going to go through the roof, because we're going to have electric cars and we're going to decarbonise our heat. But actually our grid was built for completely different generation in completely different places. So we need to build infrastructure where it hasn't been before. We need to uprate it to cater for greater capacity. We also need to operate it differently because renewable generation just operates and works differently to traditional coal or gas-fired plants. And our network needs to be climate adapted. Our network needs to be resilient to climate change. It needs to be intelligent and adaptable. It needs to be net zero itself. We have gases that insulate parts of our kit that are themselves greenhouse gases. So we need to reimagine the network in many, many ways so that we can meet government targets and get to net zero. But as I said, critically, this challenge, we need to bring the consumer and the communities with us because we're going to impact people. They're going to see this build and they're going to worry about what that means for them and their energy in their homes. So we do a lot of work to try and understand what people are thinking and feeling and what matters to them. And I just wanted to share some of those insights with you. So we've gone out to the public, we regularly do this, and we canvass our stakeholders, we canvass policymakers, we canvass our industry partners, but importantly, we also canvass consumers, the public, and we ask them what matters to them. First and foremost, they want a network that's reliable. So whilst they care about net zero, more than anything, they want us to make sure we transition in a way that reliability is never compromised. The other thing that's really interesting is that the second and third priority is all about affordability. People have really felt the sort of recent financial crisis. They have felt the impact of increasing energy bills, and actually affordability really matters. But interestingly, long-term affordability just pips short-term affordability. So consumers, the public, are saying to us, do it right, do it once. Because the important thing on the previous slide is when they built the grid in the 50s, 60s and 70s, they built it with the future in mind. They built a grid that was rated at 275 kV, but capable of carrying 400 kilovolts. They future-proofed it. They built it capacity rich. And we as consumers have enjoyed that grid. We've maintained it, we've incrementally added to it, but fundamentally it's been able to grow with our demands as society. So as we reimagine the grid that we're building today, we need to build it with the future in mind. We need to build it for 2050. And the other thing that people have said they really care about after those top three priorities is that we do it in a way that we protect the natural environment. They want to make sure that we build our infrastructure. They recognise we need to do it, but that we do it sensitively, that we think about the natural environment where we are constructing and building our assets. So in summary, it's the most exciting place to be, if you ask me. In all the years I've been in this industry, it's never been more busy, more critical, and more at the kind of heart of everything that's going on in our society. And looking forward to answering some questions and talking about it some more. Thank you.
Could we possibly hear from everybody and then have questions at the end? So hold that thought. I've got a piece of paper, you can write it down if you want. But Matthew.
Thank you. So thank you very much. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my career, which has been in two halves, really, unequal halves. So for the first 20 years, as Claire said, I was in the civil service, working with different ministers, including jobs as what's called a private secretary, where you're literally the bag carrier. And I was the bag carrier for Alan Johnson and Alice Starling under the Labour government. And then more recently had to brief different ministers, including Rees-Mogg and Kwasi Kwarteng. I can talk about more of that later if you want me to. But so what excited me about the civil service, I think, were kind of three things. The first was actually we had consistent proactive policy on sustainability. And to an extent we still do. And that's not that common in some countries, actually. Whereas in the UK, we had it. And that's one of the reasons why the UK was able to proceed on sustainability. We had broad consensus between political parties, which allowed us to make progress. So that's the first thing. The second thing which excited me is actually seeing when policy worked. So for me, it's always interesting to see the interplay between economics, the political economy, society. So one of the examples I'll give you is around offshore wind, where the UK is now the biggest market for offshore wind, and that hasn't happened by accident. So yes, we live near a very windy North Sea, but the reason why people are building wind turbines in the North Sea is because of a particular policy that was implemented more than 12 years ago. And that persuaded and encouraged people to invest in the North Sea. But as I said, it was really interesting seeing how that policy mechanism was first developed, how people persuaded the ministers to back it, how it was rolled out, and then ultimately to see it working and being deployed. So that was really exciting. And the last thing about the civil service, the last 5 years I spent essentially managing an investment fund where we had £1 billion taxpayers fund, which we then choose to invest in different technologies. And I was responsible for some of the power and flexibility sectors. So that was interesting and exciting about how to make the right decisions about, for example, should we invest in mini nuclear power stations? How do you make the argument? What analysis do you need to make the right decision? What is the right decision? How much money should we be investing? What are the choices? What are the trade-offs between the decisions? And that was really interesting. Then I'll flip now briefly to kind of my career now. So I left the civil service about 1.5 years ago, and I now work for what is essentially a software company. I am absolutely not a software engineer, so I don't do that, but I do more about the market analysis. So we're a software company which sells like essentially a trading mechanism to grid companies to manage electricity trading and flexibility. So what excites me now about the current role, we're a scale-up company, so we need to attract investment in our company, and that's really interesting. So dealing with investors, venture capital investors, explaining to them what our vision is for the next 15 years and persuading them to invest in the company. That's interesting. The second thing that's really interesting is the global perspective. So my company Piclo, we work in UK and the US and Australia. And seeing the differences and the similarities between the countries is really interesting. You've got some grid companies who are very forward-looking, actually, and actually you get some who are very, very conservative and very cautious about investing in any newfangled technologies. So that's really interesting. And then the final thing that's really interesting is actually explaining electricity and flexibility, which is about using electricity at different times. So would you be happy to be paid to use less electricity at some times? Would you be happy to use more electricity at some times, which is that's what we need? Would you be happy for another company to be controlling your electric vehicle? Would you sign up to that? And then also thinking about all the houses who don't have electric vehicles or heat pumps, may never have because they can't afford it. So how do you balance the social equity part of the transition as well? So that's interesting. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Now, shall we take a shift to a different perspective? Xinyue?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, so we're going to shift gear into talking about fine art, which is what I do. And so we've gone from a very practical perspective into something I would like to think a bit more theoretical and perhaps a bit more abstract. So yeah, right now I'm a DPhil student at the Ruskin School of Art, and my graduate thesis posits a cinema of ecological grief as a distinct visual genre. And I devised this from this book by Judith Butler, where Judith Butler talks about the ungrievable lives. The ungrievable lives defined by Butler are the ones that are deemed unworthy of public grieving in order to sanctify the violence and disavow any conception of precarity. In this way, we can think about, for example, the animals that we kill in order to satisfy our own need for food and for nutrition, or plant lives, things that could potentially go extinct under our watch without us noticing. This also could extend to human beings, how we could carelessly conduct acts of violence without really registering that the lives that we kill are lives as well. But this work, now being extended by rhetorician Joshua Trey Barnett, can be leveraged to analyze the ways we approach both ecosystems and our more than human cohabitants as actors within this dynamic play that made the coexistence more possible. So I wanted to show some of the examples of my work. This one is called Once She Dries, and this is a collaborative project that was created and conceived by myself, and a dancer, a sculptor, 3 musicians, and I will just go to the project website to quickly show you what it looked like. In this work, we're envisioning Coral as a protagonist who has his own voice, who can voice out her grief and her loss of being separated from this oceanic ecosystem that sustained her life. And then we frame this as a tragic life story because in this way we're hoping to bring more connection to this otherwise inanimate being. Then my current thesis look at ecological grief and how we can grieve a reality that is sustainable for all of us, that could also take into account other forms of life and to create something that is flourishing for all of us. So in my thesis, I'm thinking through, might we find healing in hanging on and staying with those that we have lost? What if we do not abandon them so much as we harbor them? So the lives that are lost, can we find a way to commemorate them? Can we find a way to stay with them in a way that their loss and death are no longer in vain? I think that perhaps is the biggest problem that I'm considering. So I'm positing cinema of ecological grief as a filmic endeavor that carries ecological losses through the work of mourning. In this way, it could stave off the shifting baseline syndrome where our accepted norms and exceptions for the environment gradually change across generation. So this is another example of another artist's work that I quite admire, and I want to say that I'm not really trying to compile a list of films because I think that would be a superficial gesture. I'm more interested in artists, activists, and people who are environmentally inclined to work together to create this system of visualization that could help us understand the current ecological degradation. And within this, there's a lot of softness, tenderness, and sympathy that could arise. For example, in this work, the artist simply holds a snowflake in her hand and watch it dissolve gradually. It is that kind of nuanced gaze that I think we desperately need in this age of climate crisis. So film harbors loss and offers a deliberate act of sustained remembrance. How do we make sense of other people's passing? How do we make sense of a landscape's degradation? But as an artist, I could only hope that with my visual language, I could embody their losses and carry them through my work. So the ways of seeing are never neutral or innocent. The goal is to learn to see better their particular omissions and violences, and to become accountable for them when we can. So this particular artwork was done by Jenny Kendler, who is a visual artist who collected all of these endangered birds, and she looked at the retina and she put all of these retina into a single sculpture that gazes back into humanity. In this way, we're reminded that no longer we have the power to look at nature, but in the same time, we're being looked back. So it's that kind of accountability and ethical consideration that the artist is trying to evoke. So I'm putting together a small installation based on my field work at the Center of Hydrobiology Wuhan, where the last living Baiji dolphin had lived, but now this species is likely, well, functionally extinct. I'm trying to envision this center being abandoned a decade from now on. So in my opinion, for a sustainable future to come, we must first learn to love that which will be lost if no actions were taken, the countless lives with whom we're intertwined, who insist on mattering even in death. The reason that I'm gravitating towards grief is because I think if we could grieve our lives actively and responsibly, we are choosing life. So this is my research. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And now another shift in perspective.
Yeah, hello. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so I'm Steve. As Claire said, I'm a fellow in biology at Queen's College. I'm a professor in plant sciences at the Department of Biology and co-founder and chief scientific officer of Wild Biosciences, a company spun out a couple of years ago from my research group. And we're interested in plants. We're very interested in plants because we think plants are the secret, the cure, the key to surviving the impending climate crisis that we're stuck in right now. Because they're the only organisms on planet Earth that take inorganic carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and knit it into something useful, right? We can build machines that do that. We can build $1 billion factory that costs vast quantities of energy to run that can take carbon dioxide and compress it down to something which we then can't find a use for, so we stick it in abandoned oil wells and stuff like that. But if we want to make something truly useful, we're going to need to make it from plants. And every carbon atom in your body that's a biological carbon atom was knitted into a carbon skeleton by a plant, and you ate that plant or you ate something that ate that plant. It's all of life comes from plants. And wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to make plants grow a little bit better? Because that's the secret, right? The key that we have, the one little lever that we have to trying to extract more resources out of the land that we've already got. Because if you think about, the plants growing in your garden, every single plant in that garden is growing at a different rate. You've got things that you don't want that grow really big and you're constantly cutting them back. And you've got this precious little beautiful thing that you wish would grow, but you're constantly nurturing it and feeding it and it doesn't grow that well, because not all plants, just like not all animals, have evolved to grow as fast as they possibly can, right? We're not as big as blue whales. That wasn't our evolutionary strategy, right? Lots of things evolved to be small, reproduce quickly, die young, or they evolve really long, expansive lifespans, right? So there's a whole gamut of evolutionary strategies, and plants are just the same. Not everything's trying to grow as fast as it can. And this is a problem because our ancestors 10,000 years ago, when they went out there, stopped being hunter-gatherers and just started domesticating plants, didn't go out there and go, that's the fastest growing plant I've ever seen. Let's turn that into a food crop. They went, this thing doesn't poison us. It tastes really good. Let's grow more of that. And unfortunately, the Venn diagram of what grows really, really well and what doesn't poison us contains corn. And that's about it, right? Corn is the one plant we have that grows phenomenally well and doesn't actually poison us. Everything else that we actually really like is terrible at growing. Like, it's fantastically awful. It might tick along at about 20 units. That's just without going into the details of what those units are, where some of the fastest growing plants out there are doing 80, 90, so we know there's this huge variation. And we want to understand, by looking across all the natural species that are out there on planet Earth, what is it that makes this plant grow faster than that one? Because if we could understand that, if we understand the mechanism of what makes these plants like corn grow so fast, then we could transfer that into plants that don't grow so well and get more food out of them, right? That's the key goal, because 10,000 years ago, when we started domesticating plants, it took about 2 hectares of land to feed a person for a year. And for the 10,000 years that followed that, we didn't manage to improve productivity at all, right? Just through minor increments, we got down to maybe needing 1.8 hectares of land to feed a person. And then the 20th century came along, and we invented tractors, and we invented synthetic nitrogen fertilizers for the Haber-Bosch process, and we started applying science to plant breeding, and now we can feed nearly 2 people per hectare. That sounds great, but there's now 8 billion people, right? So we need 4 billion hectares of land to produce the food to feed the people, and land is a finite resource, and we are already past occupying about 52% of the Earth's surface is now in farms. And that is what's driving the mass extinctions that we're seeing right now. That's driving rates of extinction that are exceeding the rates of extinction that happened when an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. Because we've taken land away from nature and replaced it with corn and soybeans and wheat and tomatoes. And nature doesn't live in these environments, right? They're sterile environments. Whether that's an organic farm, whether that's a high-intensity farm, it's the same. You don't find pandas wandering about in organic wheat fields, right? They're dead. We've replaced them with wheat. There's no difference in the biodiversity between these two solutions. So if we want to actually, if you project forward, this has just been going one way for 10,000 years. We've just been cutting down forests, expanding and expanding and expanding. Because even though we've improved the productivity of our crops, we haven't improved it at a rate at all as fast as the rate at which we have increased as a species. And that's as true today as it was 10,000 years ago. And so we're heading in this one-way trajectory towards complete annihilation of all biodiversity on planet Earth. And the only way we can do that is by getting more food per unit land area. That's the only thing that we can do to stop this expansion of agricultural land. So that's what we hope to do. And what we also try to do is we've already committed so much of the Earth's land to growing things like wheat and corn and rice. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could engineer these plants to actually take atmospheric CO2 out of the air and stick it in the ground to try and fight that climate change problem at the same time? So not only could we be getting food from these plants that we have to grow in these high intensity environments, we are stuck and addicted to this. There's nothing we can do about it. But couldn't we use that land for a dual purpose at the same time? Couldn't we engineer those plants to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and stick it in the ground and try and reverse climate change? Because plants are the most scalable system we have. They're the only thing we have that will grow itself just from sunlight and CO2 in the atmosphere. Nuclear power plants don't grow themselves from sunlight and CO2 in the atmosphere. You've got to pay billions of dollars and lots of energy to make them. You can just take a seed and put it in the ground and it will take care of itself. So that's what we're interested in. We're seeing, can we put more food on the top? Can we take CO2 out in the atmosphere and stick it in the ground? And can we do all of this without anyone having to change anything that they have to do? Because if we could do that, then life could much continue the same way as it is right now. That's what we try to do.
Thank you. Right. So we've gone from future-proofing infrastructure to briefing quasi-Kwarteng to birds' retinas gazing back to how to make plants grow faster and capture carbon. There was lots there. We've got a dead keen questioner at the front.
And Sara, my question was, if there's a massive transition to electric vehicles, is there going to be enough electricity and will it be net zero? And then I'll ask Steve's question so you can think about the answer to that. And And the question for Steve is genetic modification. How important is that in dealing with these massive problems that you're talking about?
So in terms of looking at what we need to do to transition the grid and build the grid, we have a number of energy scenarios that we work to, and effectively the energy scenario that's put out there by the system operator, the electricity system operator, the one that we're working to is one that assumes that we do see a transition to electric vehicles and that we have a net zero grid by 2035. So first of all, we are working and building all our investment plans predicated on the grid, the energy system is net zero by 2035. That we have moved to effectively clean sources of generation by then, and that we have built the grid that enables all of those to be connected and to get the power to where it's needed. When I talk about how do we build the grid so it's, as we did in the 50s, 60s and 70s, capacity-rich future in mind, it's not just about being able to build the grid so we can connect the generation, it's about being able to build the grid so that it caters for the demand growth. And part of that demand growth is absolutely that uptick in electrification around vehicles and around homes. And that's the challenge. But that is why it is ambitious, it is challenging, it relies on a global supply chain, it relies on a workforce that doesn't yet exist, that we have to create. We have to create supply chain, we have to create a workforce, and we have to build and deliver at pace. And we have to build in a way that we have to make strategic decisions about where to invest. So, you know, often we would get a really clear signal of, there's the coal-fired power station, build for that, build exactly for that, just the capacity you need. We have to build to scenarios. If you're trying to build with the future in mind, you've got to build a bit capacity rich. You've got to future-proof. You've got to create additional infrastructure that allows for rapid expansion. And that means, to a certain extent, anticipatory investment, which means you're always juggling what I'd call certainty and pace. And anticipatory investment has a cost to consumers. So it's about getting that level of strategic anticipatory investment right.
Cool. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. There are very few tools that we have as a sort of species that we can address this challenge with. So we've conventional breeding, which we are phenomenal at now. And we've been doing that for 10,000 years and really scientifically only since the early 1900s. And then on top of that, since the advent of sort of DNA technologies in the 1980s, we've got GM as a technique that we can use to supplement and advance on that. Now, breeding has plateaued, so there's been almost no gains in breeding in our best crops since the 1990s because it's been diminishing returns since the 1960s. You know, there's only so much you can eke out with the natural variation that's there. And genetic modification is one of these tools that we have that allows us to bring in genetic modification that we've bred out through thousands of years of inbreeding, right? And it allows us to bring some of that back in. And that's going to be one of the key tools that we've got to address this problem. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So, question at the back there.
My question's on art. As someone who 30 years after he left Queen's went to St Martin's, I've got a passing interest in that. Now, in the past, in history, art through painting has really captured disasters, crises. I'm thinking of some of the Victorian paintings of volcanic eruptions, the First World War paintings of Neveson and Nash and Guernica. I've looked, after I heard you were coming on, I've looked on the internet and there is not much painting being done about climate crisis. Is the only role for paintings now to have tomato soup thrown at them?
That's a really interesting question. Are we taking another one? Okay. I think there's a reason that there is not a lot of painting alone that is depicting the climate crisis. I was just reading this article talking about how the perspective of a vision has changed. In the Renaissance era, we have this pre-established horizon, right? Human beings and all lives, perhaps, this is a very Eurocentric perspective, but we exist on the same plane. But say, for example, Cubism, it completely shifts the way that we look at the planet Earth. And right now, with the advent of different technology and how different artists use media to portray their art, there is a sense of groundlessness. There's no longer a single vision talking about the impending disaster. And then actually, I think instead of trying to bring more images into the world, we're actually turning the world into an imagery. So this idea of how can we be accountable for the kind of images that we create, but also the way that we consume that is equally as important. So I think perhaps we should open our minds to different art practices who are using performance, for example, who are using their own body and their own existence in the environment to portray this crisis. Because I think the scale and the sort of sensorial feeling can be very hard to be captured by traditional mediums such as painting.
So the answer is yes.
Yes. Sorry, being a grad student.
There's one here.
Thank you so much. I think you all painted a positive picture of things that we can do over the coming years and decades. So I want to focus on the negative. What do you each think is the single biggest blocker to progress?
Perhaps I'll say that's two things. I think one is apathy. So some people are just saying, "Oh, well, it's either kind of right. We're all gonna burn. We just don't need to do anything. So I'll just take my 2 flights a year anyway." I think it's partly apathy, but actually partly just lack of understanding. So people just don't quite understand what heat pumps are yet, and are they more expensive or not? And so I think if you package up information in the right way to persuade people to engage, including through arts and other things, then actually that's one way of getting over those things.
Okay. Sarah.
I've got to go with a few because I'm going to, we often throw ourselves into negativity. I'm being very positive tonight, so I'm going to engage with that and use this as a cathartic relief. So I think policy is really important. Government policy, regulatory policy and frameworks and funding, and above all that, certainty. So you talked about the importance, it's so true, the importance of certainty and alignment in terms of government policy and then regulatory frameworks and funding supporting that. As soon as we get, because we're competing in a global market now, everyone's trying to race to net zero, everyone's trying to decarbonise their power systems, and they're all competing for scarce supply chain, equipment, global workforce. So actually, we need to make the UK really attractive. We need to make it attractive from a financing perspective. We need to make it a really confident and clear place around a committed pathway, around policies. Elections are nervous. You know, as soon as we get any sense of wavering around our targets and policies, that is the thing that we fear. And everything sits below that, because once you have certainty and real clear direction, you can then start to kind of make sure that you're getting the right funding, supply chain, workforce, all those ingredients that will enable the transition. The other thing, because I have to do I'm going to break the rules and do two. The other thing is actually we've got to bring communities and the public with us. You know, there's got to be public acceptability and understanding, because infrastructure is a challenge.
So what's the blocker to that?
People don't like, it's strange. People don't find pylons attractive. I've never understood it. I think they're beautiful. The Economist ran a lovely front cover which said, "Hug a pylon, not a tree." And I totally understood that. But, you know, you know, you've probably heard the phrase NIMBY, not in my backyard. I think conceptually we can all get on board with the need for infrastructure, but we don't really like it when it's in our backyard. So that's the challenge.
Thank you very much. Xinyue?
Yeah, for me, I would say patterns of consumption, so consumerism in general, how we have, like you said, incorporated, actually exploited so much of Earth resources to sustain our own growth and existence. So I think this unconscious way of existing with the world is perhaps the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, I think like the technologies are there now, and there's so many innovative people and innovative ideas. I don't think the technology is a blocker. I think what will come is more around the concept of public acceptance, the concept of the regulatory burden that's put in place between the technology and its implementation. That's what's going to stop us being able to address this in the long term.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It was a great question. So we have another question. Yes.
On the grid and the plant system, are we still right at the start of implementing these things, or has progress already been made? Because Simon Steele, the Secretary of the Climate Change Branch of the UN, said we have 2 years to save the world. In other words, things have to move very fast. Now, have we made progress, or are we still at the beginning?
I think we've made significant progress when you think about the kind of timeline of like our first concept wind farm to being in a place where we're literally 6 years away from 50 gigawatts of offshore wind and connecting that. So we have made and are making huge progress. You know, the fact that even that technology, which was almost in its infancy and seemed expensive, is now actually a much more affordable energy source and a secure energy source. But we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of what we need to build and what it's going to take to get there. It is, I think, almost on a par with a war effort. It's a war against climate change. So it's on a par with a war effort, but I sometimes think about the amazing things that we accomplish in crisis. But it's when we feel the crisis we do it. How quickly did we turn around a vaccine? How quickly was this country producing volumes of aircrafts and guns? Not a great example. During the World War, we can very quickly turn and build. But in those events, we felt the crisis. I think that's the power, actually, as I was listening to you talk, of how do we bring the crisis to life for people? How do we use art? How do we do that so that we feel the same imperative?
And Steve, you talked about quite different timescales of evolution, of change in plant productivity. Are we going fast enough at the moment?
No, not by a long way. Yeah, not by quite a considerable margin. There have been huge advances recently, but to give you an idea of just like how, even if we had imagine I had just invented something that could increase wheat yields by 30%. I have one little plant. To get that to the point where I can plant 200 million hectares of wheat, just the scale up of, even if I had the solution right now, to scale up to produce enough seeds to plant out 200 million hectares is going to take me 15 years. Or thereabouts, and then we have to solve the distribution problem across so many different countries. So as anyone who's ever tried to import anything across borders will know, it's practically impossible to move plant material across and around internationally. And so even if I had an amazing wheat plant right now, it would be very hard for me to realize that technology in a time frame that, I still have to try. But because if you don't try, then we know what the outcome of that is. But will we go through a difficult phase before we come out the other side? Yeah, probably.
I have two quick questions.
Then we'll have to. Sorry, the last question, and then we'll need to stop.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So can I ask two?
You can. Yes.
So Xinyue, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the relationship between grief and cinema, whether there's anything special about cinema as an art form. And secondly, for Steve, I was wondering why you approach the problem of land scarcity as a technical problem rather than a social and political one, because if people didn't eat meat, we wouldn't have the same pressure on land use.
I go first. Okay, I think quick answer, I can go forever on this, but I would say indexicality. So the grief is something we felt of an absence, something or someone that we loved is no longer here. And then the cinema and moving images in general carry its referent. So something that was once there and you can capture that, but it was no longer. So I think this idea of longing for something that could be, and then this possibility of hosting a composite form and different expressions is what connects grief with cinema to me. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, this isn't a single silver bullet that's going to solve this problem. We absolutely need to stop eating quite so much meat. But getting 8 billion people to do something is nearly impossible, right? It's just getting the whole world to stop eating meat is going to be, in my opinion, almost impossible. Just take last year, for example. Last year, the highest rate in recorded history of like vegetarianism, veganism in the UK, and simultaneously the highest rate of meat consumption per capita. One of those can't be, I mean, how does that work, right? So we've never consumed more meat than we do right now, ever in the history of humanity. And that's going up like this. So turning that around is going to be a huge problem. That's not in my skill set. I can make plants grow faster. I can't, you know, I'm not the one who should also be trying to make the plants grow faster and trying to get people to eat less meat and trying to solve the policy issue. I can't do that. It absolutely needs to be solved. But it's such a distributed problem over such a large scale that it's going to be almost impossible to solve unless you put a flat £100 tax per steak. You know, people are not going to stop eating meat.
Right, thank you on that. I think we all expected that was an incredibly fascinating set of different perspectives on a really big topic. And we can carry on the conversations now over another glass of wine and some canapes. And I wanted to say, because I didn't mention before, but actually one of the things that at least gives me hope, alongside of the fact that we've got these amazing people working on these amazing things, is in this room there are people who matriculated in 2022, and there's someone here who matriculated in 1952. And over those 70 years, there has been so much change, so much social and technological change, that I do actually think that between us all, we can make a real difference. So with that, as I say, please carry on, drinks and canapes. We'll move some chairs so it's a little bit easier to move around. And could you join with me in saying thank you again to this amazing panel?